Hello everyone, my name is Kara Romanow and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, the inaugural Connections Connectors Conversation Panel, a web discussion designed to bring thought-provoking perspectives and brilliant protagonists together around a timely topic to catalyze uncommon insights and cultivate community growth. We appreciate your participation and would especially like to thank ProBook for their support in sponsoring this event. Today we will be talking about the impact of the coronavirus, what happened to the economy, the impact on healthcare, and how the CPG industry responded. We will be focusing on specific innovative approaches that enabled organizations to survive and even thrive. We'll cover the role of technology, how companies will be better prepared moving forward, and the silver linings found in the lessons learned. We have three experts joining us to share their perspectives, and although they have very different responsibilities and backgrounds, I think you'll be amazed at the common threads that permeate the conversation. To start, each of them will answer one critical question that addresses a key issue, and then I'm going to step back and let them chat. We may have time for a short Q&A session at the end, so please submit questions through the comment function on YouTube. If we don't get to all of your questions, we'll follow up within 24 hours. Okay, so our first speaker will be Dr. Dean Smith, Dean of the School of Public Health at LSU, who is recognized as a national expert in the organization and financing of healthcare and public health systems. Prior to moving to New Orleans, he spent 30 years as a professor at the University of Michigan and was vice president of the board of the Michigan Public Health Institute. He also founded and grew two different statewide HMOs in Michigan. Our second speaker will be Sally Mason Boehmer, senior vice president of administration and finance at Massachusetts General Hospital, the teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School and home of the country's largest hospital-based research program. She has been at Mass General for almost 28 years and is responsible for all non-clinical functions, which includes everything from real estate and compliance to cleaning, food service, and security. And last but certainly not least, our third speaker will be Jeff Weedman, the founder of Centrifuge in Cincinnati, where he led the development of a sustainable innovation ecosystem. He is also the CEO of Weedman Ventures, where he is now launching new cancer testing solutions at SUS Clinicals. And he is the former vice president of global business development at Procter & Gamble, where he spent 18 years and accelerated P&G's top and bottom line growth via collaborations with external partners. With those introductions, I'd like to thank you all again for attending, and let's get going. So the first question goes to Dean. So what everyone wants to ask the economist is, what was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy? Curious about whether it will last, if the economy is going to bounce back. Dean, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Well, as we all know, the impact of the COVID pandemic on the economy has been nothing short of catastrophic. We experienced an incredible shock in our ability to produce and our ability to work, as clearly reflected in the data, the drop in the GDP, the increase in unemployment. However, it is my view that this impact is likely to be short-lived for the economy and for most persons as consumers, a blip in the macroeconomic statistics. We've already seen GDP rebound and the unemployment rate has gained half of its loss in jobs. We're still saving at a substantial rate, perhaps more so due to the lack of our ability to purchase services rather than a fundamental lack in desire. We recognize also that we are much more vulnerable than we had previously thought. We're also pretty resilient. In ways that we could not have imagined 2 decades ago. We've learned to work, go to school, and even have conferences like this remotely. Some of the changes in economic behavior are likely to be enduring. The shifts in how we buy and what we buy, and the shifts also in who gains and who loses in the new economy. The pandemic has accelerated shifts in the economy, the distribution of wealth. In healthcare and public health, we're ever more aware of our need to attend to the social determinants of health. So those are my opening thoughts.
Great, thank you. I want to move to Sally next. Okay, so you're representing the healthcare, the hospitals. So what did you learn about equity and how are you able to evolve to manage both COVID-19 and non-pandemic related demand? I know there was a lot going on. So if you can kind of walk us through what happened at the beginning and how it's evolved a little bit.
Sure, happy to, and thank you for having me. Yes, so certainly we are dealing now with our second surge, and during the first surge, I would say two things happened. The first was as case volume was growing and we had gotten through the initial offers to help and crisis over PPE, we then really focused on data modeling and putting together the data side with the experiences of providers. And a number of our providers came back and had the observation that a large proportion of our inpatients were Spanish speaking. And we quickly went out and looked at the data and started to see an obvious trend of equity differences in who was being hospitalized and the acuity of those hospitalized patients. And therefore really reformatted how we were tracking and our response in those communities. So we had focused efforts to get out care kits, which were educational materials, maybe masks, hand sanitizers, in those communities, developing networks of trusted ambassadors, people that could talk with the community about what we were seeing, kind of addressing either fears or myths around coronavirus and what it meant. So really developed somewhat of our equity response there. What are some of the lessons learned? I think they should be obvious, because obviously coming off that first surge of coronavirus that we saw here in New England was really right around the same time that I think some of the protests and the issues of racial justice moved up to the forefront. So as providers, I think now we are all looking at everything we do. How do we stratify, whether it's quality and safety data by race and ethnicity? How do we develop targeted plans to improve where we are, both as an employer, as a provider, and frankly, as a major community citizen? I think academic medical centers, educational institutions, we are some of those that have the obligation, I think, to be leaders in communities and try to move us forward. So that's I'd say specifically speaking to the equity issue. This second surge in many ways is as challenging as the first, because we no longer have the same restrictions on elective volume. As hard as the first crisis was, when you tampened down all elective volume and when frankly patients were afraid and stayed away, it was a little easier to manage now than when we are trying to juggle how to keep the healthcare system going, because it needs to. I think demand did not fundamentally change. How do we keep it going and juggle the second surge of COVID at the same time?
Great, thank you. Okay, Jeff. What I really want to ask you was, what was the response of the CPG industry? So there was huge demand for some categories. Obviously, consumer preferences changed. So what was the impact on innovation, and what did the industry really do?
I think it's kind of fun when you say, what's the impact on consumer goods? Think about walking through the grocery store, right? How many of, when you walk into the grocery, you all masked up and everything, didn't you sneak through the paper aisle to see if you were lucky enough to have it in stock? Didn't you kind of take the little detour around to see if they had rubbing alcohol? Oh my goodness, who could have ever guessed that rubbing alcohol would be on allocation? So I think what we saw in consumer goods is an incredible pressure on supply chain. As supply chains were built, and Dean, I think you have spoken to this, as supply chains were built to be very lean and be able to deliver the maximum amount of product just in time, all of a sudden, they're highly stressed. All of a sudden, supply chains are cut. And even if the consumer goods companies had robust capability in manufacturing, their suppliers didn't. So I think we saw amazing pressure on supply chain, which played its way out into what was available in the stores and what consumers wanted. I think at CPG, there was a massive shift from walking to the store, going through the stores, to online. I mean, who amongst us has not had to move over for a Prime truck rolling down the road to deliver to our neighbors and a different one coming to our house? So I think from a distribution standpoint, there was massive change. I think the product mix, oh my goodness, cleaning products. If you look at it in the CPG industry, but you also look at it in the startups. I spend a lot of time with startups. I had multiple calls on people who had a startup in the middle of the pandemic with thermometers that could scan you when you walked into the store, and they were going to sell it. Interestingly, their supply chain went back to China. I can't tell you how many hand sanitizer companies got started. And so there was a spirit of filling the gap and innovation that we saw. but I think was probably temporary. When it comes to innovation, I think it's been very challenging for new products, new companies, new brands to get a foothold. I mean, how do you get distribution in a store where you can't even go in and present it? I think what it's also done with people having to work remote is it's forced companies to start looking for their innovation more than just inside their own doors. When I stop and think about it, though, it's honestly, this is a great opportunity. This has shaken out a lot of inefficiencies in our supply chains, in our choices of products that we want to take to market. So I kind of look at the pandemic, and it was really tough, but it's also a wonderful opportunity. You know, Dean, I read your write-up, and as being a consumer goods guy at heart, I was very struck by your comments on what this means or could mean to big brands as you talked about loyalty. Would you mind kind of commenting on what you're seeing there as an economist and what your thoughts are?
Sure, thank you. You know, it's really interesting, and I'll say something, and you might completely disagree, which will make it a much more entertaining webinar. But we're seeing people uncertain about what is sort of the right thing to buy, what's safe to buy. Yes, Amazon will deliver anything to you, even a roll of paper towels in 24 hours, and return it for free. But people are observing scams, and they're seeing, you know, product that got to market too quickly. So I think people are tending to revert to brands as a signal of quality, as an indicator that, you know, it's something that's going to be worthwhile. And as you suggested, if you can't see it, if you can't touch it, and your only recourse of shopping is to order it and return it if you don't like it, you know, that's a lot of hassle. And so I think that at least in the short run, we're going to see people steering more towards brands, not just sort of at the small scale consumer products, but sort of large scale distribution as well, which may mean that companies have much more tougher decisions about sort of making new products, buying them, you know, how they source their innovation as well as how they innovate themselves.
Now, can you comment
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
reasons?
Oh, can you, sorry, you're clear now. Can you try again?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that thread, that supply chain thread with you, because when we talked, your supply chain has gone through some challenges, but for a little bit different reasons. So can you comment on that?
Sure, it has. And I would say in healthcare, for better or worse, I think providers have been very used to having flush cabinets, right? And their perceptions during COVID, when we had to more highly centralize our supply chain, particularly the personal protective equipment, the PPE that was very hard to get, we became highly centralized. It was tough as a manager to hear particularly our staff, and sometimes it playing out in the media around the shortages and were we keeping the workforce safe? And it was tough because oftentimes my awareness is, no, we have it. We're just managing it in much different ways than we as a general public are used to. I think we are used to having an abundance. And when things are scarce, and being more carefully measured and allocated out, I think the psychology of that was very tough for our workforce. So we spent a lot of time on two things. One was having that dialogue with the workforce and being very clear around what the status of our supply chain was, being direct and honest. We had to spend a lot of time if we had to shift products. Healthcare is highly regulated, testing, ensuring it was safe, and then educating staff on how to use perhaps a slightly different product. I mean, I will even announce if we're changing the brand of hand sanitizer. Staff notice and want to know why we're making those changes. And then finally, I think we could go back to Jeff's comment on innovation. I would say in the beginning, one of my biggest challenges, we were overwhelmed with offers to help. Industries who wanted to, because perhaps they weren't producing the same amount, move in and help. So face shields might be the best example. Anybody who was in plastics was, can you send us specs? Can we help create face shields to keep healthcare? that has subsidized, has really dwindled a little bit since the beginning. But in the beginning, those offers to help from innovators was just unanticipated and almost overwhelming. So now in any crisis, we will be, I think, more formal about those portals of how people connect to us if they have an idea to help, and how we connect to the innovator community.
I want to pick up on that innovation theme because that's something that I talked to all of you about. So innovation of product, but also of process. And when we talk about innovation, it's not just coming up with a new idea, it's getting that new idea to stick. Sally, you talked about, you accelerated a lot of processes. So how do you get those things to stick? Jeff, obviously you focused a lot on innovation of companies and of products. What made this different? What was different about what people were forced to do? Is it because they were forced and didn't have a choice that they had to be more innovative?
Well, honestly, I think that in some ways this was a massive disruption that the status quo was simply not going to hold. And there's lots of interesting quotes out there. Everyone has a plan till they get popped in the nose. I mean, that's a Mike Tyson quote. And so I think, necessity being the mother of invention in this place, all of a sudden companies could not be self-sufficient. And when you look at innovation, there's an awful lot I've experienced over my career of we invent our own stuff. We have the best processes. But when your employees can't come to work on it, when you can't move it through the system, then you have to start looking at other places. And I'm fond of saying that the consumer doesn't care where the innovation comes from. I suspect, Sally, none of your patients really cared who was the source of the mask that the nurse or doctor was wearing. They just care that it works. And if you break that mentality of let's get the best innovation, regardless of where it comes from, that allows you to start looking outside more often. And this whole open innovation, I think, is important. And I think this could help pivot more of that in the same way that Sally got lots of people volunteering. I suspect 9 out of 10 of them hoped that their contracts would survive post-pandemic so that they had a new customer. So I think in some ways, if we embrace this innovation and we don't care where it comes from, we just care that it comes to us so that we can take it to our clients, our customers. And you know what? It's probably worth a lot more with a brand name. You put the Clorox brand name on a cleaning product right now, pretty trusted. Consumer doesn't ask, did you get that from that small startup in Pocatello, Idaho? They don't ask. So I think this concept of sourcing innovation hopefully will be accelerated because of the pandemic. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Can I ask Sally a
ahead,
question here? I'll put her on the spot. After the pandemic started and we had all these shortages of ICU beds and particularly of ventilators, there was a surge of these companies from General Motors subsidiaries elsewhere that were going to produce inexpensive, perhaps not great quality, but just good enough ventilators that they got a lot of attention. Did those ever happen? Did Mass General buy those?
We did not buy those. I've read a little bit about it. We did not. I mean, as you might imagine, the country, right, could have done some level loading, which was another interesting concept around how we collaborate, because the pandemic spread to different regions in different times. How much you had to do from net new procurement versus perhaps how you developed a shared resource model, either in your local geography or a broader definition, were items that got discussion. So I think we were more ready from how would we borrow ventilators if we had hit up against that than going out and buying the net new ones. So we learned a lot about modeling, level loading, and some of those concepts that I would say were hopefully some things that'll stick going forward. Really, models to predict our supply chain. We didn't know how many N95 per day we were using, respirators, right? There was a lot about our own businesses that we didn't understand, that we needed to develop models to predict. How many ICU beds are we going to peak at? How many ventilators are we going to need?
How do you calculate that demand? Because everything is based on what are we going to need. So curious about the definition of demand itself, a need versus a desire versus a want. Sally and Dean, we had both talked about elective versus emergent medical procedures. So can you guys talk a little bit about that changing definition of demand?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And Dean, you should definitely take it. What I was very curious about is that we looked at the data during the first surge, and we saw a number of medical conditions, I use strokes as an example, go down 30%. Clinically, that doesn't sound intuitive to anybody. That something like a stroke was fundamentally different. You can look to some things, less traumatic injury and other areas where demand did change. People didn't need the healthcare, but I mean that's a need, not demand. What we are really trying to track now is how, as people's perceptions of safety, what they are going to put off because they don't want to come into a hospital, and are there further downstream consequences that we should worry about because it was a necessary care that was deferred too long. So I think this story is going to take a longer cycle to play out.
I absolutely agree. And, where you stand always depends upon where you sit. And I sit in the School of Public Health, and we are so concerned about the people who are not being attentive to preventive services. We had a webinar yesterday on colorectal cancer screening and services, and the attentiveness to that is way down. Now, we're hopeful that things like HPV vaccination will go up again as we overcome some of our inherent fears about vaccination. And once everyone has their shot, hopefully you all soon, we'll be in a better position. But it has disrupted our planning about how we assure that everyone in the community has access to preventive services. And it doesn't take much of a delay in that process to see 3 and 4 years down the road, so the impact of that. I recognize that people desire to have, new hips and knees, not necessarily because it's urgent, but because, people like our friend Doug, don't play tennis that well, and he thinks a new knee will help him play better. That can be deferred, and we don't sort of lose sleep over it. We do lose sleep over the people who do have that stroke at night that otherwise they would have called the ambulance for. Now they sort of ignore, and that has down the road ramifications.
Let me shift gears a little bit. I want to ask about technology. You guys mentioned a little bit about the shift online, the shopping online. Telemedicine we haven't talked about yet. So it's not just the consumer goods shopping, but it's CVS and Walgreens, offering some medical services. So I'm curious about that shift. Jeff, let's start with you about the online shopping, because I think that was coming anyways. So has it just accelerated? And then let's just move on to Dean and Sally about the telemedicine piece.
Well, I think it's accelerated. I think sometimes people oversimplify and say, well, retail is going to go away because everyone will go online. And I think Dean's already spoken to the fact that there's a lot of scams and things like that online. And so you want those trust factors. I think retail will find itself, it's already accelerating to be much more experiential, right? How many of us walk into a grocery store and we pick up ready to go foods, things that we never thought we needed and stuff. And so I think there's going to be a growth there. But I don't think it's an either or. I just got off a call. I'm on the board of my undergraduate college, which is a small liberal arts college. And overnight, they had to flip the switch from a residential in the classroom to online.
Right.
And I was talking to the faculty leadership. We had a call with them. And it was absolutely fascinating because they did it. Okay. And we have the full range of faculty. Dean, I'm not making any comments on faculty's adoption of technology. They did it. But we asked them, so what's next? And there was some very interesting comments. There was one, I can't wait to get back full touch in the classroom. But there was a couple of others said, this technology has augmented my ability to deliver content. And I think that it's going to be a combination of technology and in-person capability to deliver a better product than I could have done just simply, in the classroom. And they talked about people who would not respond in classroom. They sit in the back. I represented that comment, and not engage. I didn't represent that. But online, they're engaging more. So I think there's a lot of nuance, and it's not going to be, it's all tech. It's not going to be all telemedicine, I don't think. Is it, Sally? But can that augment, the visits where I have to run the gauntlet, get tested, all that stuff, to talk to the doctor for 5 minutes? I don't know. That's just a thought that I think it's an and, not an or.
Completely agree with you. I would look at it both on the management side and the clinical side. So on the management side, I think, we have gotten used to Zoom and some other things. And again, what you hope is you build on the pieces that work and evolve it. So now I think back at how much time I used to spend driving and traveling to meetings, where I think in a long-term way, it'll say, boy, where can you keep electronic mechanisms as a replacement in person, and where are we hopeful to get back to in person, because it matters. Clinically, I would say telemedicine has took off. We struggled. It is something we're trying to reflect on. Why did we struggle to get adoption of telemedicine prior, but made it work during a pandemic? We are now up to about 35%, I think, is our new norm of visits are being done. And big differences by specialty. As you might imagine, mental health will largely stay at very high percentages on digital. We are not so sure in an area like cancer. Maybe you can do an initial screening, but those patients need to come in. So I think we're going to see ranges depending on what you have and where in your healthcare journey are you around how much it can be done in those of mixed. However, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the theme we started on for me, which was equity. We need to be careful that there is a gap in availability of electronic adoption. And we are very worried about equitable care for all our patient populations, and not all will be able to do televisits.
Yeah. The equity issue is important in healthcare. It's also important in education, that we have so many students who don't have the financial resources. They could get to class, but to think that they're going to have the bandwidth, particularly when they're sharing resources in their families, it's become a real challenge. I'll flip the telemedicine issue a little bit, though, to sort of focus in sort of my area of managed care and payment systems. Payers responded with their willingness to compensate for telemedicine in sort of a quick way. And many of them have extended the duration of that. But it's really going to be this interesting conversation that happens between the major health systems and the major payers about whether they're willing to continue with that. Managed care resisted for a long time full payment for telemedicine services. And if the payment side isn't there, the delivery side won't be able to afford to provide it in the way that it has.
Dean, just following up on the online piece, from a business perspective, kind of just curious to get your opinion on what that's going to mean for both suppliers, for the CPG suppliers, and for those retailers that are now playing a bigger role both in online delivery of CPG related products, but also of medical necessities and maybe even medical testing or vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like the internet generation hasn't already hit us, right? We're clearly moving in that direction. This has accelerated what we're observing, but in many senses, this is sort of the way the future is going. You're too young to remember this, Kara, but there was a show called The Jetsons when we were children, where they used somehow microwave ovens and they looked at computer screens to talk to people in other sort of groups. So this is coming, and the pandemic has really accelerated trends in the consumer products here. And I think services and products are different here. Services have been pushed. But in the product space here, it's hard to push back on this. Right? You have people that will push back and say, yes, I'd rather see people in person than on a screen. But eventually for products, it's either going to be in your hand or it isn't.
Right.
And the electronics is how we buy it and how it gets delivered to us. But I haven't seen anything that suggests people don't want to have products. Right?
They still want their stuff, right?
We still want our stuff.
Right. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Kara, I want to take a slight vector on technology, which is we've kind of talked about service delivery, product delivery, and stuff. Sally, you mentioned managing, and I both you and Dean have large organizations I suspect that you manage. One of the things I like to do is watch what's hot in the venture community. What are the startups that are getting funded? And I will tell you right now, HR plays in technology are very hot. They're popping up all over. They're getting funded. So as you think about it, a disparate, dispersed workforce, right? How do you build culture? How do you give feedback? How do you build mentorship? And there's lots of technology coming to play in that space, so that if I don't see you for a year, 6 months, whatever it is, I can stay in touch with you, not just on your work delivery and your product delivery, but who you are, meeting you where you need, what are your needs. And so it fascinates me that you can do that kind of mentorship, and some of these companies have amazing results. And it was kind of eye-opening for me, because mentorship for me, when I was mentoring someone or being mentored, it was usually going down and getting a cup of coffee and having a conversation. It didn't feel systemic, but there's a lot of money going there, and I'm deeply respectful of following investments, because that's the next generation. And lots of people pop up with great ideas. If no one's willing to fund it, it's either before it's time or it's not such a great idea. HR technology is coming. And I think it'd be interesting, Dean, how do you manage your organization? Sally, how do you manage an organization where you may or may not even see them? And what are the tools that you need, or do you have gaps in that? I'd be curious, because it fascinates me.
Want to go, Dean? I would say we're talking a lot about this, and where those lines will be drawn, we don't know yet. One of the initial reactions is always, can this lead to real estate cost savings, right? But if the infrastructure is not there to support the quality of the interdisciplinary teamwork that you need to run a really good organization, you want to go cautiously at your primary driver being, how do we keep a remote model to save on real estate costs? So I'm glad to hear there's a lot of investment in that space, because I don't think, again, the way we've set up this kind of working together in crisis will be the right sustainable model going forward.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things about it that just are not, the boundaries between personal and professional lives, for example, have been very blurred. And part of that is the crisis, right? Schools aren't in a normal state. Various things about people's lives are not. So there's no hours of work anymore. People are constantly working. And is that sustainable? So I think there's a variety of challenges I'd love to see us debrief on, and then figure out what are the solutions out there that can help overcome those.
We're a campus that's widely distributed, sort of across facilities or across sort of the state, and we moved to electronic systems for performance reporting and all of those things, as well as all of our HR trainings had been virtual pre the pandemic. And so I think sort of the ship has probably sailed on that, as companies, sort of looked at what other folks that were already sort of in distributed environments were doing. But to Sally's point, this is really critical. People are stepping up to this challenge that's facing their organization and the country for the pandemic. And so it's easy to go that extra mile and to really sort of put efforts into it. Whether that's sustainable is really unclear. There's a lot to be said for having that real conversation with someone over a cup of coffee.
Absolutely. And actually, the digital workplace is the topic of our next 2 web sessions. So February will be focused on ops and the automation side, and then March will be focused on the people impact and HR. So absolutely, we're seeing that as well. Okay, I have one final question and one final topic, really, and that is loyalty and empathy, because I think a lot of people have been struggling. A lot of consumers have been struggling during the pandemic, whether it's for financial reasons or whether it's mental health issues. So how do institutions, how do companies, how do healthcare providers show empathy? And does that lead to longer lasting loyalty? Because obviously loyalty is something that we talk a lot about, those big brand, that loyalty that Dean and Jeff both alluded to. What is the impact during the pandemic? And if you show somebody empathy, does it make a difference?
Well, I'll start and say,
I threw that one at you.
I hope empathy makes a difference independent of its impact on your bottom line. And that as people, we have, I think, a responsibility to take care of one another. And I certainly hope that with the pandemic that has affected everyone, but the poor and vulnerable disproportionately, that we'll sort of grow some empathy here. And I hope it has a sort of a human resources or economic bottom line. But if it doesn't, I don't think it's wasted.
So I might go a little broader, and I might define it. I'm hearing, I feel like more companies talk about some of their values. So for us, we are trying to be very transparent around, we call it safe care commitment, right? What are we doing to keep you safe when you come into our organization? I think we're trying to be very transparent around equity, that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted populations, and that we need to have a role in measuring that, sharing it transparently, and fixing it. So I think values and companies really articulating what their values are something I hope we continue to do and is sustained. But you are seeing more of it, I think, certainly in my industry right now.
I would totally agree. I think you see most companies of any size are talking about their values. They're talking about what they want to do beyond selling another case or something like that. And I think that's a great trend to put those kinds of things front and center, because they're aspirational and people will start to measure against it. I also, though, think that it's not just what we say on the billboard, it's what we do. I had a call this past week from a young man that I mentor. He had just changed jobs from one Silicon Valley startup, it's actually kind of in a scale mode, to another one. And he was replacing a young man that was moving to a different job. And right after the guy that I mentored got there, the guy he was replacing died of COVID. And he got to see firsthand the CEO's intervention in terms of meeting with everyone in the department, asking people what they needed. My friend, also, his grandmother passed in like 2 weeks later. So here he is, changing jobs, new environment, new people. And when I talked to him, all he could do was rave about the kind of support that he got as an individual. And I think those are the kinds of hands-on, real people actions that will build amazing loyalty. And I think that's, set the goal and then deliver in a very hands-on way. It's going to be in the execution. But it was amazing how he reacted to that. It was cool.
Right. A lot of opportunity to be a good citizen and be a good friend these days. So thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up for today. I would like to thank our brilliant speakers, Dr. Dean Smith, Sally Mason-Boehmer, and Jeff Weedman. And I'd also like to thank ProBook for their sponsorship. We'll have a replay available within 2 hours, and we'll be posting summaries of our speakers' perspectives as well. So please follow ConneXiOn on LinkedIn for more information about participating in the community, making custom connections, and impacting conversations like these. Watch the ConneXiOn LinkedIn page for information about our next sessions, which, as I mentioned, will be focused on the digital workplace. And stay safe, everybody. Thanks again for your participation.